Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first panel, Investing in Financial Services. I think one of the more relevant topics in the current environment. So the way we're thinking of doing this is have about 45 minutes of discussion between the panelists and then open it up for Q&A. And I'll kick this off by having some of my own comments, having invested in Indian financial services over the last 6 years. Across that time period, I've been invested in two banks, two large public sector banks, one life insurance, and about 2.5 NBFCs. The half NBFC because it's going to probably be announced in another 2 months. And Hinduja Leyland Finance is my most recent investment. So let me give you a bit of a historical perspective, and then I'll open it up to the panelists. This morning, I jotted down like some of the top things that I thought if I were to focus on 4 or 5 points as to why financial services has been a great sector for investing and where we are today. So historically, if you look at this sector, and when I say historically, go back, forget the last 6 months, go beyond that. So you've had like secular growth in this sector with a combination of high ROEs and good high stable capital adequacy. And on the secular growth point, if you were to just do a statistical analysis and link this to nominal GDP growth and the total credit growth in the system, you get, if you take since 1991, it's about 1.5x nominal GDP growth, and if you take since 2000, it comes to about 2x nominal GDP growth. So the correlation is just absolutely strong, and focuses on the point that financial services tends to be the backbone of any growth economy, and India was no different and is no different. The second thing was the reducing NPAs. If you go back to the mid-90s, we were around the 12 to 15% NPAs, depending on which report you're reading. And if you go back to the 6, 7, 8 period, that NPA figure was as low as 2 to 3%. So you had high growth and you had low NPAs. The third one was, it was more or less a strong and positive regulatory environment with RBI over there. And from an investing perspective, that's very important because at the end of the day, all of us work on these shareholder agreements and share subscription agreements, and you put that on one side, and on the other side you have this RBI norms and the RBI regulatory environment. And if given the option in choosing one over the other, I would any day go with the latter. With RBI sitting over there, it gives me a lot more comfort investing in many of these companies. And the last one was opportunities for exits, which is, again, when it comes to private equity, is a very relevant factor. The reason why, and one of the statistics that one of the banks presented to us was that if you look at all the private equity exits over the last 5 years, and to some of the opening comments also were there, 70% have been financial services. And the reason for that comes down to a couple of things. Because of the capital adequacy norms, the companies have to continuously raise capital to grow. And when you're continuously raising capital, you're not left to the vagaries of how the promoter is thinking about it. You're guided more by RBI norms. And that basically opens up opportunities to raise capital and for previous investors to exit. And this environment, with these kind of trends, if you were to look at any sector in the country, I don't think you will see these kind of secular trends in any sector. And if you look at what has happened since 1991, the market, and I have Ashish over here, so don't hold me to these figures, but the market capitalization of BSE in 1990 was about 6.5 billion. And I've extrapolated at the current exchange rates because these figures were run at, I think, 54. And at that point, the total market capitalization of financial services companies in India, in the BSE, was about 0.25 billion, contributing about 3.8%. If you look at this figure today, the market capitalization of BSE companies is about $1 trillion, and the market capitalization of the FinServ companies is about 150 billion, contributing 15%. The only sector that holds greater weightage, at least in the BSE companies, is oil and gas. Other than that, it's financial services, and then you have IT, consumer, and all those things in terms of weightage as a contributor to market capitalization of BSE companies. So when it comes to as an investor, if I were to highlight just three things as to what makes a good investment from my perspective in FinServ, having lived through India in 2008-9 and the current environment, it's three things. One is good management teams. In spite of RBI and GAP being there is still a lot of discretion in how to account for many of these things. And a good management team is my first thing. Second thing is control over your liabilities. It just gives you greater control over your destiny. Third thing is try to get limited multiple compression when you exit. And multiple compression is a given that when we come in, we are coming in at high multiples, but as long as you can focus on limiting your multiple compression, I think you're okay. So if you focus on these three things, have kept me and the firms I've worked for in good stead. But let's see now where we go from here. So coming to today, right now, some of the challenges that I see, rising NPAs, increasing interest rates, reducing liquidity, reducing economic growth. It's a triple, quadruple whammy on all fronts. You have your denominator, which is reducing. You have your numerator, which is going up. I was with a very esteemed colleague of our industry about 2 days back, and he made two specific points which struck with me. One was, this whole CDR mechanism, it was never meant to be for the companies. It's meant to be for the banks, right? And he said that the second point he made was, if this environment persists, the NPAs are going to hit about 12 to 13% and is going to wipe out the entire equity base of the banks in the country. Entire. Well, it was a scary thought. So, and you always have this whole restructuring things and the CDR that comes in, so it's very difficult to get the exact figures, but it's a scary thought. But one comment that I'll make, and then I'll open up to the panelists. The guy who used to run one of the large private equity firms I worked for, he said one thing. He used to remind us of this in 2007, 8, 9. And he said, in India, things are never as bad at the bottom and never as good at the top. So who knows? And with that, I'm going to open it up to our panelists. And Mahesh, I'm going to open it up with yourself. And again, just a historical perspective, where we are, where do you think we're going from here?
So, Sachin, I quite agree with what you said in your opening comments. Just for a perspective for the group here, as you rightly mentioned, the total contribution of the financial services sector to the overall market cap is today 15%. But if you were to just go back as of 31st December 2012, it was almost 20%. It still continues to remain a very large contributor to what we believe is going to be playing out as a secular long-term growth story. We all live through cycles, so while we are all in a gloom situation today, it doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. So we still continue to maintain growth at maybe some people will say 5, some people will say 4.5, but we still as an economy continue to grow. I think the significant part to note also is that collectively all of us, along with a host of Indians, all of 1.2 billion, also do end up making some savings. Maybe savings are compressed in today's times of inflation, but that's here to stay as well. I think the complexity is increased manifold in the last 1 year, so to say, in terms of the risk profile of businesses that we all look to invest in. And when I say risk profile, it's all got to do with the environment, the macro environment that we all stay in. So for example, as again Sachin mentioned, we are all cognizant of the fact that India is a signatory to the Basel III norms. People have to have and meet capital adequacy, but now that's going to get accentuated further with the NPAs increasing. The NPAs will increase across the board is our belief. In all banks, I'm not going to be naming the banks, most of the NBFCs should also be having some issues on the ground. But somebody has got to come in and then fund the gap, because the growth will still be there. The loan book growth will still be there. It may not be the same 15 to 20% growth as we've seen in the historical past, but there is going to be growth. Now you also have to keep in mind that the RBI has now said that it will want new banks to come in and will want to issue new licenses. We don't know when that policy announcement will finally play out, but in the near foreseeable future, one should assume that will also play out. Those banks will also need to look for raising capital at some point in time. But those banks, when they come in, they are obviously going to increase competition for existing banks. So how is it going to be possible for existing banks to cope with rising NPAs, managing loan book growth, managing increased competition, and still continuing to show decent return on equity? It in itself presents an opportunity for guys like us in the private equity space to look at those businesses seriously. Our personal view is cumulative effect of the NBFCs and the entire banking system will want to raise anywhere from $15 billion going to around $30 billion more of incremental capital in the next 3 to 4 years. It may happen faster, may happen later, I don't know. Some of them will defer decisions as well. But that's a large amount of capital. Is that kind of capital genuinely available? The answer to that is yes, India will attract capital. Capital has always flown in, but capital will flow in only when the environment around the regulatory regimes permit the capital to flow in easily and get out easily. In the current context, again, I go back to what Sachin said, pretty happy with what the Reserve Bank is doing in terms of regulations, managing the system pretty well, but there are still some bars and impediments to making capital come in. There are caps, 5% caps, which actually limit the total exposure of capital that people can take. It's not that we, as funds, don't want to invest more, but those kind of challenges also have to be looked in specifically from a perspective of putting money to work. And lastly, from our perspective, I think in the entire environment that we see the banking and the NBFC business and also the payment business, having invested in businesses like AGS, we are investors in IDFC and NSE as well. The view is that tomorrow's consumers will be far more savvy on digital platforms. So the banking regimes will have to actually adapt to actually digitization and digital technologies to actually make the cost of services much more easily available and valuable, make it value conscious for the consumer. But you will have to again invest in these kind of platforms to make it easily available. But all in all, I'm not so pessimistic, even in the current environment. Do believe that India will offer enough scope for future investing. Yes, we are challenged in the macro in the environment today, but we all live through cycles, so this will also go away someday. I'm not here to say that the entire regulatory mechanisms and the political system will correct itself soon, but at some point in time it will, and it will again present some opportunities.
Thanks, Manish. Ashish, if I can invite you into this and get your perspective, especially as you're the CEO of the exchanges, your generic view on this, and also more specifically on the exchanges.
Thank you. I think I have several perspectives. One from the running of the marketplaces, other is the exchange as a kind of investment vehicle itself. The way I've gone through some of this over last almost 20 years. Say in 91, if you were to invest in India, the rules were different, the ways were different. If you got your transaction executed on the same day, you would be lucky. Today, we are talking in terms of microseconds. BSE is just now in the process of implementing a technology from Deutsche Börse, which will give you response time of around 100 microseconds. So basically, in those days, we used to do around, in the best times, still many of us go back to the great past of Harshad Mehta. The best days, the BSE used to do around 300 crore of transactions. Today, Indian markets do 5 lakh crore on a reasonable day, So the numbers have gone up, the market, the transaction volumes have gone up probably 1,000 times. The brokerage, which used to be charged, also has gone down by almost 99%. So there are a lot of changes. Of course, there are taxes and duties and everything else has come in. But those days, the industry was very kind of self-serving, inward-looking. Today, you have exchange presence in 1,700 locations, 300,000 terminals across the country, and through mobile, internet, you can practically reach anywhere. Now, what happens is, it's not only about distribution of equities or a secondary market of equities, that is through IPO or through secondary markets, but also distribution of mutual funds, distribution of SMEs, and so on and so forth. So it's basically we are trying to leverage what has been created. What has been created over the last 20 years is basically what I say, automated transaction platform, a risk management framework using clearing corporations, which does real-time risk management in Indian markets. Indian market are one of the most, what I call, the most advanced and one of the craziest markets in terms of doing things in a totally automated way. Today, as per the regulations, if anyone trades in derivatives, my system checks each individual's portfolio on real-time basis for the margins his broker has put in with me or his mark-to-market at that second or at that microsecond. Nowhere in the world the clearing system actually takes place like this. It's actually passed on to the banks, and banks are supposed to not fail except once in a while like lemon. But in India, we have said that we don't worry about what the money in balance sheet is. What money in the exchange hand is what is more important. And so it has gone completely wacky in sort of taking what we call real-time risk management to a different level. Third thing is depositories, which is again created a framework of recording holdings and then transferring them. Now all these three infrastructure that has been created nationwide are being at least thought to be utilized for many other things. So the exchanges started with equities, then we went into equity derivatives, then debt derivatives, currency, so on and so forth. Now mutual funds, SMEs, IPOs, offer for sale. You can name earlier, I don't know how many of you have participated in offer for sale, but earlier an issuer would take 2 months to come out with an offer for sale, and he will spend probably close to 10% of the issue size to do offer for sale. Today, it is done in a fraction of a percent in one day. Next day, money is in his pocket. So somewhere in the line, what we are trying to do is to leverage this infrastructure that has been created of distribution, of holding records. So we are also trying to hold, say, academic records of people. We are trying to hold even the insurance policies in DMAT form. So we are trying to do many things, which is basically leveraging on what has been learned over the last 20 years. And that's an interesting part, like mutual fund distribution. For me, the mutual fund distribution industry, especially the distribution part of it, is imploding. I was told today morning that in America also, 4% is the cost of distribution. In India also, it's almost similar. The other side, the ETFs are basically leveraging on the exchange mechanism, and that's where ETFs in the world have actually grown at much faster pace. Not because they give great returns. It's just that the cost of distribution, when you take away to a fraction, and that also is now on the person who is buying and not on the person who is selling, it just makes a tremendous sense. And we said, in the Indian situation where now the entire commission framework is changing, where you have direct guys not paying any commission, you have different commissions for the city, different commission for the rural areas, and there are many, I mean, you don't even have upfront load. So because of that, you have to only pay out of what you earn. Because of this, now the distribution framework is actually imploding. All the mutual funds have created 30, 40, 50, 100,000 distributors. They are nowhere to go. And probably in a month's time, the new regulations are going to come where you can actually have even smallest distributor becoming part of BSE using the same infrastructure to distribute mutual funds, and that will get the units in the depository account of the buyers and so on and so forth, and get the money in 2 days. So it's basically the way we look at it is the distribution framework is changing. Through mobile you can buy and so on and so forth. This industry is going through a huge change, and the exchanges are at actually the forefront of this entire distribution activities. For me, I can see times where I will be distributing fixed deposits and so on and so forth for NBFCs and other things. So somewhere, for me, the technology is enabling me, and over a period, this sort of business is going to go in a totally different direction. The old guys, if they don't manage themselves well, they are going to be in a different sort of world, and someone else is going to take over the framework. And SME is something I just wanted to give you a perspective. Last year, we started a platform for SME. Till now, 28 companies have got listed, 15 more in pipeline, and it doesn't, the prospectus doesn't go to SEBI for approval. It's approved at the exchange level. So from start to finish, that is, you approach the exchange to coming out of an IPO, is basically around 2 months' time. And you have to give two-way quotes because market making is required for 3 years, and minimum lot size is 1 lakh rupees. But effectively, a small industry or small company's legitimate need to raise finances is actually met by removing the small investors from the sort of framework. Otherwise, there was an issue of vanishing companies, if you remember. And that was because the small companies were collecting money from small investors, and then small investors keep on crying that the company died. Whereas if the large investors come in, then it actually makes sense. And so we have seen some green shoots. My understanding is that many of you invest in companies. Instead of asking for an exit at some point in time, if you invest through an IPO, at the time of investing in SME framework, only 50 investors are required at the time of SME IPO. If you invest at that point in time, you get an exit, the promoter gets a framework, and you also get an additional sort of a regulatory authority going after the company to meet the obligations of the companies and so on and so forth. So I thought these were interesting sort of points you should know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashish. Many of the points you touched are very important, and one of them is intermediation, which will lead into our next panelist, Sudeep. My personal view on intermediation is, if you look at the macro penetration data across credit classes, overall credit, mortgages, access to equity markets, we are just low on every front. It makes for great slides when we are presenting to our global ICs. They get excited. But the fact of the matter is that India continues to be a disintermediate market, and no better to comment on that and some historical and future perspective than Sudeep.
Thanks, Sachin. In fact, this entire intermediation space or distribution of financial products is going through a huge turmoil, I can say. I'll just start by giving you, and asking you rather, what are the most successful financial products in the history of independent India? I mean, very clearly, I'll just keep giving answers as well. One is the postal savings. I think every single household used to have postal savings, whether it's in terms of a savings account or a Kisan Vikas, Indira Vikas, National Savings Certificate. So who was distributing these products? There was a battery of postal agents who were and are still doing the job of intermediation. And you'll be surprised to know, in fact, last year RBI takes out a report on the total payout to these postal agents. Last year, the payout was close to 3,000 crore to the postal agents by the Government of India Postal Department for distributing the postal saving schemes. The second most successful product, undoubtedly, I think the Life Insurance Corporation of India's insurance products. Now, how is this being distributed? How is this being distributed even today? They have a large agency network. The total agency force on ground is close to 15 lakh. So 15 lakh agents are distributing, collecting significant commission, and ensuring that insurance penetration reaches the desired level for Life Insurance Corporation of India. Now, I think these two very related incident shows that anybody who wishes to be successful in financial product distribution, marketing, needs to have a network which is well entrenched, which is diversified, which is across the country. Without that, you cannot penetrate. Also, simultaneously, let's look at very two recent examples where good financial products have been actually a disaster in terms of, because they didn't have distribution. If all of you will remember, NPS, 2009, the NPS was launched with great fanfare. The regulator, with some belief, which probably was not right, went on harping on the fact that they want to ensure that the cost of the product is lowest. And they succeeded. I mean, I think it was kind of crazy, looking back at those figures which the mutual fund industry quoted for the mandate was crazy numbers, 0.001%, or that's kind of charges they were planning to levy. I mean, they committed to levy. What was the result of that? Forget the government employees who were bound to shift due to the regulatory reasons. There were less than 10,000 private individuals who opened account in the last 4 or 5 years. It was a complete disaster. Yes, the regulator took cognizance of that and have reworked the scheme and doing multiple things to rejuvenate the product. But the fact is, if you don't want the distributor in the entire value chain, in the entire chain, I think you are trying to do something which is absolutely unviable. Look at the recent example. Ashish did talk about the mutual fund industry going online and trying to do things. But look at what happened to the industry. And look at what's happening even today. The regulator wanted to cut out the distributor in some form or the other. They wanted to do everything directly. Conceptually, it's great. I mean, why should an individual, you, me, when buying a product, pay anything to an intermediary? We can very well buy directly. But does it work? At least the example which we have in front of us for the last 3-4 years, it's an unmitigated disaster. The sales have come down drastically. The folios are getting shut. The fact is, in every walk of life, we go and buy a suit, we go and buy a pen, laptop, iPad, phone. I mean, there is a distributor. We go buy vegetables every morning. I mean, we don't go to the farmer. We go to a shop, whether it's a Reliance Fresh or the Sabji Wala close to our house. Who is he? He's an intermediary. There is a commission being paid to him. He's rendering a valuable service. I think in all our excitement about, cutting out the intermediary, creating an environment which is completely disintermediated, we are doing a huge disservice to the financial services sector as a whole. This doesn't work. Today morning when we were discussing, Mahesh was mentioning that even in US, the cost of distribution of a mutual fund product is 4-5%. I mean, it's bound to happen. Why will somebody distribute a product if he is not being remunerated? So the question of disintermediation, I think, is somewhat absolutely out of sync with normal economics, normal commerce, and common sense also. So the objective of the regulator, objective of the entire industry should be to ensure that there is no mis-selling. Everybody should be cognizant of the fact that mis-selling is a menace and we should stop mis-selling. And it starts with the product. If you approve a product which is not fair to the investor, I think the mis-selling starts there. So we have to carefully select the product. We have to ensure that mis-selling doesn't happen. If somebody is doing mis-selling, by all means, do whatever needs to be done, punish him, ban him, suspend him, but doesn't mean you throw the baby along with the bathwater. You can't completely cut out distribution. Look at the scope as far as distribution is concerned. Penetration of most of the financial products in India compared to even the developing countries, I think is abysmally low. Insurance, which is a critical need both for savings and for the protection for individuals, as well as long-term infrastructure development for the government and the states. The penetration is only about 4%. This, when you compare against other developing countries, again is abysmally low. How do you ensure that insurance reaches out to people? You need distribution. You cannot force an insurance company to own the channel. That makes it completely unviable. So you have to understand, and we have to understand, that the potential which is lying unlocked of this entire distribution, nobody in India today is focused on creating a pan-India distribution channel. And we need brick and mortar along with online. The people need financial advice, even in the remotest part of the country. Why do we keep getting these chit fund scams on a regular basis? It's simply the fact that people need something beyond the bank fixed deposit. And who is giving it to them and on those remote areas? I think the chit fund guys are trying to reach out and do these frauds. Why they're able to do this? Because organized distribution, organized intermediation hasn't reached those places, or isn't trying hard enough to reach those places because they don't have incentive to do so. So some organization, funds, regulator who realize that today for ensuring financial services penetration, for ensuring an organized and wholesome growth of the financial sector, intermediation is critical, and you have to ensure that the right remuneration structure for intermediation is put in place. I think only then we will achieve financial inclusion, we will achieve the desired goal of taking financial products to the masses. Thank you.
Thanks, Sudeep, and hopefully along the way reduce our reliance on gold. That brings me to Shrenik, and Shrenik, from your perspective, looking at this sector, and especially coming from this whole branding angle, how do you look at this?
So, when I look at it from Bennett's perspective and from Brand Capital's perspective, so Brand Capital is really the investment arm for Bennett as a media company, and we our mission really is to go and partner industry in areas where we feel that structurally there is significant growth, and also where we find transformative growth. So it's not just quantitative growth that we are chasing. So in a 175-year history, Brand Capital is just an 8-year-old business for us. And if I look forward 10 years or 15 years, and I create a scenario of where financial services will be in this country, so just reacting to where Mahesh said it is today. So if it's fallen from 20% to 15%, I feel that in the next 10 or 15 years, it will perhaps go back up to 25% maybe. So there's significant quantitative growth that we are talking about. Purely coming from the fact that penetration of financial services to India as a whole. So I'm not talking about the top 3 metros or top 4 metros. I mean, where do we see what is the penetration of financial services to India? So that we see as a massive structural opportunity from a long period, from a long view perspective. I think the other thing that we see is not just the quantitative expansion, we also see the transformation of it. And when I say that, I mean it in 5 or 6 different ways, such as how do we see financial services distribution, reach, intermediation? What is the framework that is being applied? So when we say that this is an industry which should not be giving much distribution fee, are we also saying that there is no value to be added through the entire distribution? It's a major question which we'll have to rethink. What is the value that the distribution chain adds? And as a result, what is the fee? The second transformation really is, just the trust and the ethics framework that need to apply to this industry. So, having set up an international office for an Indian investment bank, I had the opportunity to closely study how Europe, for example, regulates financial services. And it's just really fascinating how different the underlying approach to trust and governance is. So, just to give you an example, if in India you have a long specification of what all needs to be specified in a DRHP, for example. In the UK, there is no such document. There is no guideline on what needs to be specified in a DRHP. It says whatever is needed for an informed investor to make a decision, it must be there. So there's no need to specify. So there is an underlying trust, there's an underlying skill standard, and there is a way which you can enforce this without having to resort to to hair splitting. So that's the other thing that will change. I mean, the trust framework which is underlying in the governance. The third thing is the skill standard itself. So if you look at financial services industries worldwide, it's a highly regulated industry in terms of, you know, who constitutes the service provider. So what kind of people can you employ for each of the roles? So, you know, for a customer-facing role, what kind of skill standards are needed? So the very extensive standards on, you know, which is just completely missing in India. The fourth piece which I find missing is just really the, you know, the awareness, the consumer awareness piece. How are these products being bought? Are they being bought because of a nice advertisement? Are they being bought because someone is hard selling this to consumers? Or are they being bought because there is adequate information about these products that's being made available by way of you know, the right format of advertising, etc. So transparency, awareness, disclosure standards, all that needs to change. Of course, and as Ashish said, technology and, you know, how the service that will change, and obviously I think the other thing is just the degree by which we are connected to the global markets. That's just a massive transformation we are seeing. So currently we are investors in 2 exchanges. I think there's proposals to invest in 2 more exchanges. We are investors in an insurance company, and we are still hungry for more.
Thank you, Shrenik. That brings us closer to a Q&A session, but I'm going to tee it off with my first question to Mahesh. So 2009 taught me to have a far more greater focus on liabilities, and it was a tough lesson, spending months on end just trying to figure out the asset liability mismatches in some of our investments. And coming through that, what lesson we learned, or I learned, was the person who had greater control over his liabilities came out sooner and stronger out of that downturn. But coming into today's environment, where, you know, you have to grow your asset book because of the NPA squeeze, at the same time there's a liquidity squeeze in the market. So what do you do?
Well, again, Sachin, I guess what you're saying is absolutely correct. But I guess every issuer, be it any company, has to actually decide the next course of action. I would suggest much more faster than what you and me think. The problem is actually going to accentuate as time passes by. Our belief is that the NPAs will actually balloon, but the NPAs itself present an opportunity for guys like us as well. So, for example, there's no reason why asset reconstruction businesses can't do well. There's no reason why credit bureau information businesses can't do well. There's no reason why the assets that are locked up as NPAs need to be unlocked as well, because there's going to be some buyer for those assets as well. So that presents an opportunity. But my question is, what is it that the banks or the institutions, the NBFCs will do to address this headlong? So credit assessment as a mechanism needs to change. We are all familiar with concepts called VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Yes, it's here to stay. But are our systems geared to do credit assessments on a very, very different scale? I think still the investment needs to go in to actually understand the dynamics around what's happening around us. The US, the Japs and the Europeans have printed so much money that money has actually lost relevance and value. And therefore all asset classes have seen the bulge in values as you've seen. But that's no longer here to stay. They will all compress later. What happens then? It's exactly what you're going through. So I'm saying investment in people, investment in reskilling people is important as well. But more importantly, be cognizant of what's happening around you in the markets and be ready to take the next surge much faster than what you and me can actually anticipate.
Question for Sudeep. As we look at these several distribution models around the country, and I've looked at maybe 5 or 6 over the last 6 years, you know, the challenge that I as an investor faced was that because of the lack of remuneration or lack of compensation, you know, it does not make for a good investment, right? So it's an expensive proposition to build out a nationwide distribution channel without no real convincing light at the end of the tunnel. So what do you say to that?
No, I completely agree with you, Sachin. I think we are to be blamed for this. We have got ourselves into a situation where it's become a vicious cycle, and somewhere we have to break out of this. As I was mentioning, some cases the regulator also we need to have a dialogue with the regulator and explain to the regulator probably the fallacy of trying to cut out the distributor. You need to prevent mis-selling, but that doesn't mean that you cut out the distributor. Online is a great mechanism, but beyond that, somewhere the products need to be taught. Most of these financial products are not a pull product, they are push. You need to explain to the individuals, you need to teach him what it does for him, and then only he will buy. Now coming back to the specific question that how do we get out of this rut where we are in today, I think there are 2-3 ways of doing it, and I'm sure people will go ahead and try this. Life insurance still does provide a significant remuneration for the distribution channel. It can be a backbone for setting up a pan-India distribution network. You have to, of course, rely significantly on technology. If you try to put everything on brick and mortar, your costs will go out of control. So you have to combine technology intelligently along with brick and mortar. Pretty much what the banks in India have done and what the ATM has done to the banking industry. 20 years back, when we were growing up, we used to go to the bank branch, take a token for a cash withdrawal, wait for hours for cash to come out. Today, the ATM has changed that. I don't think I've visited my bank branch in last 10 years. So somewhere we have to use technology intelligently, but back it up with brick and mortar. Create some champions like life insurance and take the rest of the product basket along with it. Having said that, I also must warn that as a distributor, I will not like to sell any product which has no remuneration for me. We are all here for economics. We are not here for social service when you are setting up a company. So if somebody expects us to sell something for free, like what the NPS wanted to do, like what probably today the mutual fund regulator feels, it doesn't work. Nobody will sell. Why will I send my salespeople to meet some investor where I know there is no remuneration going to come? It can be for a larger relationship, but only for selling that product? Answer is no. So we have to understand at both level and develop a network which can demonstrate to the market, to the investors, that it can deliver results.
One question for Ashish, and then we're going to open it up to everybody else, is I haven't looked at exchanges in the last 3-4 years, but going back to 05, 06, 07, it was one sexy space to invest. There was multiple expansion, consolidation going on around the world, and General Atlantic actually made a lot of money investing in NYMEX and then again in Bovespa in Latin America. And if you look at India, you have now the movement going away from cash to F&O, and again the total remuneration, for lack of a better word, for a transaction going significantly down. So while you have gone from 300 crores to 5 lakh crores, I don't know how the total pool of comped capital that comes back to you has that gone. So any views on that from an investment perspective?
No, like any other industry, like distribution industry, banking industry, our industry is also changing very rapidly internationally and also in India. Indian regulations are slightly more oligopolistic, so we'll continue to make significant amount of money in future. But effectively what's happening is the old exchanges internationally are trying to merge to show a dream, Even in 2005, 6, 7, they were losing market share, and they were trying to show that if we merge two international exchanges, two large exchanges, we'll save significant costs. So because of that, our earnings will go up, and so you give me so much of sort of PE and so on and so forth. And 2007 onwards, what has happened is, internationally, equities market have come down by 80% in volumes and remain there. The futures options have actually gone up. And still you can see last week ICE took over New York Stock Exchange. It's basically for me, it's like Amazon buying Washington Post for sort of as a toy, is a nice little thing to have. Similarly, ICE buying New York Stock Exchange is very similar to that in a perspective that you want a marquee brand with you. But if you don't use it in a new modern change, in fact, New York Stock Exchange got taken over by Archipelago early on last decade. And otherwise, I mean, even after Archipelago took over, it's still below probably 25% or 20% market share, or now probably 10% market share, because newer markets are coming up, newer ways of doing things. And if we don't sort of look at the newer ways, we try to, I mean, any established business tries to take juice out of the existing cash flows, existing revenue model. And we kind of try to work on that because all of us are invested into that, even the employees and the management and the owners. And we kind of don't take the newer stuff in a right sense, and slowly the newer stuff becomes larger and the older revenue source remains behind. It happened in front of me. Equities, the trading floor was the main revenue source, and actually that was not the revenue source. For an exchange, revenue source in those days, in 94 when I set up NSE, was listing fees. In BSE, 80% of the revenues were listing fees. And I said, when I started NSE, saying, if I try to run an exchange on listing fees, I'm dead, because nobody's going to list on a new exchange. So I will run on a transaction fees. And so I started running on a transaction fee. And still the differentials were so large, it worked out, okay? Within 1 year, NSE became larger than BSE. But by 2000, BSE had come back and it was like 55, 45, 55 NSE, 45 BSE. But the newer part, which I set up of derivatives, I started working on it on 96, but 2001 it was allowed. From 2001 to 2003, it didn't look successful at all. It was looking very odd, very ordinary, nothing, the product was not picking up. And 2003 onwards, it picked up so much that today derivatives, volumes and revenues for exchanges are 10 times larger than equities. So for me, the way I look at it is non-linear payoff, buying lottery ticket in a simple way is what I work on. I basically create small little business models on newer areas, mutual fund distribution, offer for sale, IPOs, these, that. And so unless I work on it, I'm going to be a stock exchange which is going to be basically irrelevant, although it may remain in size similar, only thing the world has become much larger. So that's basically the perspective for all exchanges. And internationally, deal flow in my industry, exchange industry is pretty large. Hong Kong Stock Exchange took over LME. Moscow is merging 2 exchanges, Japan is merging exchanges. So many of the investment bankers who are not getting other business are busy in our industry. They may get remunerated, not remunerated is a non-issue. But effectively, we are seeing too much of merger largely to save costs, and newer one of the biggest issues the incumbents like us are trying to do is to stop the newcomers from coming, right? And the newcomers will continue to come because the business model, the technology, the frameworks, the distribution model, everything is changing so rapidly that unless we kind of capture some portions of the newer emerging reality, we are going to become irrelevant. And that's how I have seen BSE from being numero uno to less than 20%, and now again coming back. And because again you focus on something, you capture and then buy lottery tickets, some of them become large, again you are into game, right?
Well, it's open for Q&A.
Do we have a mic? We start over there and then come over here.
My name is Nikhil Swadhi, and I've recently started a used vehicle financing NBFC. My question has to do with sort of RBI regulation. I think the panel views it as a huge positive. My question is, with the recent proposals in terms of provisioning for standard assets and whatever have you, bring that more in line with what the banks are doing in terms of 100% at 90 and increasing the provision for standard assets. What do you think the effect will be on NBFCs? Because a lot of people have the view that the customer who borrows from an NBFC is typically very different than a customer who borrows from a bank. So what do you think it'll do to the NPAs and to the performance of NBFCs if the proposal goes through?
Well, if I get your question right, our personal view is that the regulatory regime for NBFCs will still become tighter in environments like this as we stay in today. It is going to lead to your NIMs being compressed. It is also going to lead to your returns for the short to medium term looking lower than what historically you've seen. But it also means that you've got to be prepared to, have more capital at work to play around with, which means that you need to constantly have that level of net worth with you, backing you, because the regulations will get tighter. And therefore, the cost of competing with other firms will also make it a little bit more difficult, which is why I'm saying that how efficient you are in your risk mitigation exercises. You've got to invest in risk mitigation as much as many other NBFCs do, but it has to change. The paradigm change has to be brought in today in times like this. And therefore, you will see your business getting diluted or slightly impacted in the short to medium term.
I think one good thing that RBI does is publishes these draft guidelines, and I don't know how much of the adjective draft really means draft. So it gives you, in most of the NBFCs, enough of a runway in terms of catching up with what is actually going to hit them. So many of the good NBFCs, have usually worked with much more stringent norms than what you would probably, regulators would allow them to. So the 6-month, 3-month NPA rules, and many more like these. Most of them, there is one thing that you publish for the gap perspectives, but for the internal MISs, they just operate on that. So I think the good thing of RBI is, while they might be coming up with these an increased or stronger regulations or tighter regulations, is a better word, there's enough of a runway for NBFCs to catch up. And that's why this good management team, which is my first point of investing in financial companies, is very, very important.
So great morning to everybody. I'm Ashish Agarwal from JLR Finance. My question is to Ashish Chauhan. As you told that in this SME exchange, there are almost 40 listings are already there and 18 are in pipeline. If you see the current scenario and whatever is happening in the country last 1.5 years and 1 year, the other IPOs are not in the market and all. So what kind of investors are there who are putting money in this kind of companies, first of all? And are they getting return on that money, or really what they're looking for in these kind of IPOs actually? Because everybody is willing to go for, we are investment bankers, we are looking for putting up the money in these kind of this thing basically, but we would like to know what is happening actually.
It's an interesting question. One way I look at it is, only 50 people are required to do SME IPO, vis-a-vis 1,000 minimum for the normal IPO. But more interestingly, the normal large IPOs are more than fully priced. While as the SME guys are themselves not confident of their business models, nobody knows them, so they are much modest in their expectations of their pricing. So to give you a perspective, I think you got probably I miscommunicated, I gave a wrong information. 28 companies got listed, 15 more in pipeline. Around December, we launched a BSE SME IPO index. Just to give you a perspective, it basically keeps the company for 1 year after IPO. It started with 100 in December of 2012, I think November, December 2012. Yesterday I saw it was 349. So it gave returns of around 250%, which is, I think, non-trivial, right? So in some sense, because those guys are modest and their business models are kind of shaky in their own minds and investors' mind, there is lot of money that is kept on table, and that's where you have a significant upside that is possible in this framework, and that's why probably more and more sort of investors are coming into the market. But my current understanding is that most of the investors are kind of either vendors or suppliers or sort of neighbors and friends, because there is no marketing required. They don't do much marketing, unlike a normal IPO which spends 15-20 crore rupees to do an IPO. These guys spend, what I've been told is, around 50 lakhs over 3 years, for including market makers cost, merchant bankers cost, and every other cost put together. So they don't have the money to do marketing and so on and so forth, but the value they are putting on table, it's basically what is attracting people, I guess.
My name is Amit Bansal and I've just come back from US and I've worked for investment banking for ABN AMRO Bank and I've done a lot of credit analysis there. So I have a question here, we talk about NPAs, but if you look at statistics, the NPAs are much higher for the public sector banks and then it's much lower for private banks and then foreign banks is less than 1%. So I think there's definitely a big gap in the credit assessment because, why there's such a huge difference when public sector banks are more than, 5% and then the foreign banks in India are less than 1%. And with the new bank licensing coming up, do you think we may actually see lower NPAs because, maybe there's a difference in assessments in the private banks compared to public sector banks? I just have a question.
So, as I said, we do believe that the credit assessment mechanics has to change. Is it that the PSU banks have lesser, tighter assessments? I don't think so. It's just that there is enough and more pressure on them for the size and scale that they already have for them to, lend out the book. I, for one, can really tell you that having seen some banks closely, private sector banks closely, there is scope for further improvement, is all I can say. Will NPAs come down in future? Well, from an investor perspective, the answer is we would certainly want to see it come down. From everyone's perspective, that's the answer. But I think there is a need to invest further. For example, debt to market cap as a benchmark number, if you were to tap, you can yourself get answers as to what really is happening in the economy, okay? Asset cover, interest cover are the standard norms that anybody, and DSR are the standard norms that anyone follows. But is that enough in the market environment that you sit in today for whatever is happening around you? Our view is no. You got to really do much more than what it is. So it's gathering information, analytics around what you see with numbers. Numbers are historical. By the time it comes to a banker, it may be too late. But what does the future hold? So banks need to also invest to see what's really happening sectorally in that business from a perspective of assessing risk and mapping risk to a particular borrower, because that's also important. So a lot of changes will, the Western world has perhaps seen it. We are still learning it, but I'm not saying that we are far away. It's just a matter of investing in, go back to what Sachin said, do you have the right teams in place? Do you have the right technology platforms to, invest in situations like this as well?
There is, foreign banks, private sector and public sector, but and there is a, degree of difference in their NPL levels and all. But having, understood that and realized that, you also must reflect on the fact that an economy which was growing at probably 9% suddenly slows down to 5%. That's number one. Number two, look at sectors, telecom. Suddenly the licenses which they were holding, got cancelled and all kind of nonsense started happening. The coal blocks, the power sector, the gas pricing, the entire, a segment of the industry got into problems probably because of no fault of theirs. And this is an unprecedented situation. It is not like, probably to take an example, Chinese bank lending forcibly to Chinese PSUs and there's those becoming NPAs. The situation in India and the reason for this NPA to an extent is different. I'm not absolving the guys of the responsibility. I'm sure there are also, as Mahesh said, there's scope for tightening. But there are certain things in this particular environment which was probably beyond their control and nobody could have predicted those.
I think with that, we have to end our panel. RBI came out yesterday with the new HTM, AFS rules and the depreciating rules, so there is an occasion to drink tonight. And hopefully you'll see us all today evening or at coffee we can chat. Thank you guys. Thank you everybody.